So what class on vampire films wouldn't be complete without a screening of Twilight? I apologize in advance to fans of Twilight for what I'm about to say, but for the rest of you, you're welcome that I only subjected you to one Twilight, as there are several. But I still think it's important to watch relative to our other films, and it is kind of our most recent iteration of vampires. So I think it's an important film. I'm not the biggest fan of it, but I don't think the course would be complete if we didn't watch it. So I'm sure many of you know that Twilight is based off a series of books. So this is what the books look like if you were to buy the box set from Amazon. So we are again presented with a film based off of a book, not unlike Interview with the Vampire. So this is another case of a film that is narrative is drawn largely from a book. Again, I still argue that the film is the film and the book is the book, but it still is important to know that these were incredibly popular books. And part of the attraction to the films is the attraction to the books. We also have a film that once again ends with a bit of a cliffhanger. So I have that screenshot for you there, and you can see below the number of sequels that were released for this film. Again, based off of the books, but still a total of 5 films related to Twilight, which is a lot. You can think of many sequel films that had sequels, and not many of them include 5 in the series. So this is at the longer end of films that have sequels. So, as vampire films go, we once again are presented with depictions of families. We have good families, these kind of pale vampires, but they are supposed to be the good family. They're shot in a particular blue hue, as is most of this movie. I don't know that that particular coloring has anything to do with their status as good or bad, but you can see that when the bad vampires appear, and this would be an example of the bad vampires, they also have that blue hue, but it tends to get a little darker. And if you look at the top and the bottom there, one is considerably lighter than the others. And if you go back to a film like Near Dark, where the good guys were in white and the bad guys were in black, that sort of coloring is a part of filmmaking, signaling to the audience that something has changed. And in this particular case, even though it's not as clear as it may have been in some of our other films, I do think the good guys and the bad guys are colored a little bit differently. And we'll see some examples of that here in a second. So the Twilight films have a great deal of American Indian imagery, and this shot is a good example of that. There are others, and there are more in later films. But certainly, what Fan ends up talking about in the article is the film's connection to American Indian imagery. And it's important to think of relative to this as an American film, and how American Indian culture and conflicts fit into its narrative. So I just wanted to use this scene as an example of that. The Twilight films also have a fair amount of teen angst. So here you see them kind of at the lunch table. They look relatively happy here, but there's quite a bit of teen struggle in these movies. More so again than a lot of our other movies. If we had watched, say, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the movie, not the television show, you may have seen some more of that kind of teenage drama. And there was some of that in Near Dark. But ultimately, most of our vampire films deal primarily with adults. And when you factor in teenagers or young children, there are other issues that come into films that teens struggle with that adults don't. Some of those have to do with identity, fitting in, peer relationships. Those are very much a part of the Twilight narrative of both this film and the others. So I think it's important to note, just as another aspect of what makes the Twilight films unique, it's working through teenage issues in a way that our other films are not. Another kind of aspect that's unique about the Twilight films is we don't really have vampire hunters per se. We have vampires versus vampires, and I include this shot as a kind of really good demonstration of good vampires versus bad vampires. But we don't have vampire hunters. They don't seem to be hunted. And again, that is not the case in all of our movies. Some of our movies have vampire hunters, and some of them do not. But one might also almost suspect in this kind of film that someone would be looking for them. And that really doesn't come through in Twilight at all. I mean, there is that kind of police presence, but it doesn't seem to be in service of finding vampires. It just seems to be kind of general police work. So the biggest conflict here is between different kinds of vampires as opposed to vampires and those hunting them. So Prince spends a little bit of time in chapter 5 talking about dramatic focus. And for Prince, dramatic focus is tied pretty heavily to editing. So the editor actually plays a significant role in the filmmaking process. And we've alluded to this in the past, but this is one of the more detailed discussions of that. So the editor can cut film footage to create a dramatic focus that wasn't there in the original footage. Editors can actually create scenes that are not in the script. And Prince gives a couple of examples there. Annie Hall and The Godfather are two examples that pop up in the textbook of editors actually doing work to create a different kind of narrative than maybe even the director had envisioned. So the role of the editor in the filmmaking process is significant, and I think that's what the key takeaway is here. The editor is not a small player in the filmmaking process, and when we talked about the film production process, editing and post-production are significant steps in that process, so they shouldn't be overlooked. Part of the editing technique involves establishing tempo, rhythm, and pacing by changing the length of shots. So that brief shots where they're cutting from shot to shot to shot creates a much faster pace, and longer shots tend to create a kind of more measured pacing. So you can think of a lot of examples in film where multiple cuts are used in a much more fast-paced moving film than say a slower, more dramatic film, and that is a function of editing. Editing can be used to establish mood. Um, Ultimately, if you want to create a particular kind of mood, that can be done through the editing process. And ultimately, editing also permits filmmakers to control the flow of information and point of view. So if you think about point of view shots in, say, horror movies, the editor's tight zoom in, and I think we've talked about this before, can prevent you from seeing other things that are going on in the room, and ultimately that is a lack of information to the viewer, and then the viewer can be surprised or scared by something that happens coming from presumably off screen. I thought I'd include the vampire entrance. This is certainly our nicest looking vampire entrance. The lovely doctor walking in. He doesn't really look like a vampire. He's a little pale, and he seems to be wearing some makeup, but that seems probably more a function of being an actor in a film. But as vampire entrances go, this is a different kind of one. And if you were not watching this film, knowing that it's a vampire film, you may not even think that you are witnessing a vampire entrance. Nevertheless, it is a significant point in the narrative. He takes up the whole screen. His entrance is important narratively, but different kind of entrance than, say, some of the other ones that have either been calling out the vampire in particular, showing teeth, or the vampire doing something dramatic or scary or disturbing. This isn't that. But this is an interesting entrance on the part of one of our vampires. We're again presented with a film that has some similarities and differences from our other vampire films. So we see the superhuman strength that vampires have in this film, and of course they also fly around and move in ways that are not human, so that is very vampiric. Um, that is something that we're used to seeing among our vampires, so it's not unusual to us. Certainly, this is our most involved love story of any of our vampire films thus far, even I would argue more than a film like Near Dark. This is very much a love story film as they're trying to kind of work out their relationship. And I think part of that is also the teenage story. It's sort of an expectation that we have in the teenage film that there's going to be some sort of love story. And then just on a side note, we once again have vampires that cast a reflection. And I would think that the reflection casting is one of the least stable vampire elements that we've seen across these films. The reflection seems to pop up again and again as something that some vampires can do. So even though the not casting a reflection is very much a part of vampire lore and vampire mythology, films seem to play pretty fast and loose with that. I would argue in part the reflection is a good cinematic technique. Reflections work really well in film to create drama, to make scenes look bigger. So having characters be able to cast a reflection helps in a film narrative. Additionally, it's a lot less work in creating a film, in editing, production, post production, to sort of erase the reflection that someone is casting. So when you just abandon the vampires don't cast a reflection myth, it makes the filmmaking process easier. In that sense, you can see the filmmaking process interacting with the narrative process. What's more important, making the film easier to shoot or staying true to a vampire myth that says they can't cast a reflection? So this is another example of, hey, we'll let them cast a reflection. I also enjoy that these are glittery vampires. They don't seem as scary to me when they glitter like this. But again, that's a part of the narrative of Twilight, that this is what happens to these vampires in sunlight. They get all glittery. So I thought I would point that out as a significant difference and a little funny. I mean, I think viewers that take the Twilight series very seriously don't find it humorous that they glitter in this way. But I think almost everyone else that knows vampire movies thinks it's a little funny that they kind of twinkle in the sunlight. Here we are again with our evil vampires, and I would argue that these scenes are two really good examples of them still being shaded in the blue that everyone else is, but a much darker blue. In part to signal that we are looking at a different kind of vampire. So it's worth pointing out relative to our other shots of good vampires and bad vampires that these are bad vampires in the narrative, and the camera itself is signaling to the audience that they are bad vampires. It's important to keep in mind, and we'll talk about this here in a second with the article, that the Twilight series is a distinctly American vampire series. And we saw some of that in Near Dark. I mean, those were very American vampires, very Western vampires. But even when you think about the vampires in From Dusk Till Dawn, the end of that film signals that they are not American vampires, not even North American vampires, that they have this kind of foreign presence beyond their native origins. Here, the Twilight series likes to signal to us again and again that you're in an American narrative. So we have things like baseball, which is very American. We have things like prom, which is also a very American thing on film. I don't know if they have prom in other countries. They might well have prom or something similar to that. But when we think of prom in film, it's almost universally something that's part of an American film, or at least a film that takes place in America. Another important point about the Twilight series is there was a great deal of buzz about the two main protagonists having a relationship outside of the narrative. That in real life they were a couple, and these were just a couple of the kind of Hollywood shots of the two of them together. Uh, Audiences seem to enjoy that, and they seem to invest what was going on in their real relationship in their enjoyment of the film itself. Um, so there was a great deal of publicity related to them, and their relationship lasted pretty much until the films were done. I think they broke up not long after the end of the final films airing, but they became tabloid fodder. So here's an article from TMZ. Here's an article. I did not write that on there. That is part of the article that's online. So I do think it's funny they broke up over their vacation because he wanted to go to Transylvania. And then another article from E! Online talking about their breakup and now they're okay with each other. So they're still going, despite the fact that the relationship's been over for a little while. They still seem to be popping up in the news as hanging out, and people still seem to care. Um, so I think this is a good segue into the article that we read for Twilight, which is really about not addiction necessarily in the sense that you would think about, but it's people's kind of attraction to the Twilight movies and the Twilight characters, particularly Edward. So for Fan, the way in which Fan uses addiction, it's the what audiences negotiate with the narrative and what pleasure they get from watching things again and again, from anticipating the next version or the next sequel. Um, and you can see people's attraction to the Twilight series and the way that they lined up around the block for the next movie, not unlike what people did for, say, something like Star Wars. And you could apply this argument in a way to Star Wars, but the Twilight fandom, the way in which people enjoy these films, is pretty unique, and certainly different than any of our other vampire films, but different than a lot of other pieces of popular culture. People become dependent in a certain sort of way on when the next film is going to come out, on the marketing around these films. For Fan thinks of addiction both on the sort of metaphorical level and on the clinical level. The idea that a physical need, is being fulfilled by these films, and the way in which people behave, in some ways demonstrates that a physical need is being fulfilled for them. Fan also says that the way in which we think of addiction depends on the kind of time and place we're talking about. So thinking about addiction as something that's historically constructed is important for Fan. What Fan says is that it's not necessarily new that people would be addicted to a male star in the way in which audiences appear to be addicted to Pattinson in the Twilight series. So that's not unusual, not new, but it is very specific to this film, the way in which people get so wrapped up in his stardom, in his personality, in his off-screen life, that is an element of enjoyment for a lot of people that watch the Twilight films. If you've ever heard the people refer to Team Edward, ultimately what Fan is talking about is the Twilight series is one and the same with Robert Pattinson's persona as an actor, and that is important to think about this character. Would the character be read differently if it were played by a different actor? We'll never know that because it's only been played by one actor, but ultimately it seems as though people connect the character to the person, whether or not they actually know the person, just kind of what they know about the person, or at least think they know about the person. So that's part of this kind of addiction that Fan is talking about. I would take a look at the screenshots that Fan offers in the article. There's kind of a shot-by-shot discussion of editing and camera angles in Twilight. Obviously, I won't get into all of those here, but it's an interesting analysis and certainly worth looking at. And what Fan says is not all that different than what I had said earlier, is that the Twilight series is connected to many American narratives. Um, Family values, fraternity culture, political tension between whites and Native Americans, our kind of romantic feelings about the American Northwest, and then the conflict between native bred vampires and werewolves. These are kind of American narratives. And Fan believes, and I would agree, that Twilight is very much an American narrative. So, what are we left with? We're left with Twilight was certainly incredibly popular as both a series of books and films. Audiences were captivated by the off-screen relationship of the stars of this film, and for many of them, they read that back into the film that they were watching, so that is unique to this particular film. Though we've seen it in other, not other films in this class, but other films. So say Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie's relationship being read into Mr. and Mrs. Smith, for example. The role of editing came across both in this film and in prints, so it's important to know what editing does for dramatic focus. Know how Fan is applying addiction to Twilight and Twilight viewing, and what's in the article, and how addiction is being used both clinically, allegorically, and historically. And what aspects of Twilight would we consider an American narrative? Unlike most of our other vampire films where the vampires are distinctly foreign, this film is certainly different than that.